You can dismiss a quiet man in a single meeting, but you can never predict the moment his character will become everyone else's greatest lesson. Rain traced slow lines down the towering glass walls of Sterling Dynamics as another gray Seattle morning settled over the city. Inside the executive boardroom, every leather chair was occupied. Financial forecasts glowed across enormous digital displays. Quarterly projections, restructuring plans, and investor expectations filled the screens with numbers that seemed far more important than the people sitting around them. At the far end of the conference table stood Victoria Sterling, the 38-year-old billionaire chief executive officer, whose reputation had been built on impossible decisions made without hesitation. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy suit and looked around the room with calm authority before speaking. Today, we are simplifying our organizational structure. No one interrupted. Every executive understood what those words usually meant. Victoria continued reading from the report in front of her. Several positions will be eliminated immediately. A heavy silence settled over the room. Ethan Walker sat quietly near the middle of the table, his light blue shirt neatly pressed, his posture relaxed despite the growing tension around him. At 39 years old, he had learned long ago that panic rarely solved anything. Since losing his wife years earlier, every challenge had taught him the same lesson. Stay calm. Stay kind. Keep moving forward. Victoria finally lifted her eyes from the document. Ethan Walker. He looked up with quiet respect. Yes, your position has been eliminated effective today. Several executives slowly shifted in their seats. One manager lowered his eyes. Another quietly exhaled. Ethan simply nodded once. I understand. Victoria appeared almost surprised by the absence of protest. Human Resources will assist you with the transition package. Ethan stood, carefully closed the notebook he had carried into every meeting for years, and placed a pen inside the front cover before thanking everyone around the table. It has been a privilege working with all of you. I wish the company continued success. There was no bitterness in his voice. No accusation, no attempt to embarrass anyone. His quiet dignity made the room feel smaller than any argument ever could. As Ethan walked toward the conference room doors, he paused only long enough to collect a framed photograph from the side cabinet. It showed him smiling beside his 11-year-old son, Noah, during a camping trip in Olympic National Park. The picture had always reminded him why every difficult decision after his wife's passing had been worth making. Outside the boardroom, Noah sat patiently on a bench with a library book resting on his lap. School had ended early for a teacher conference, and Ethan had promised to take him home after the meeting. The boy immediately looked up when the doors opened. Dad! Ethan smiled gently. Ready to head home? Noah noticed the small cardboard box in his father's hands and quietly understood more than most children his age ever should. Did something happen? Ethan rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Sometimes life changes without asking permission. Noah studied his father's peaceful expression instead of the box. Are you okay? Ethan smiled again, this time with a warmth that reached his eyes. I still have everything that matters. Together, they walked through the bright corporate lobby while employees continued rushing from one meeting to another without realizing that a man who had quietly helped build their company was leaving for the last time. Victoria remained inside the boardroom, staring through the glass wall as father and son disappeared beyond the revolving doors. For reasons she could not explain, the image lingered in her mind far longer than the financial reports still waiting on the conference table. Minutes later, somewhere deep inside Sterling Dynamics, one unnoticed warning indicator quietly changed from green to yellow, and no one in the building realized that the real crisis had only just begun. The rain continued falling as Ethan guided his aging pickup truck through the quiet streets of Seattle, windshield wipers moving with a steady rhythm that almost sounded like a patient heartbeat. Noah sat beside him, holding the small cardboard box that contained everything his father had carried home from Sterling Dynamics. A framed family photograph, a worn notebook, 2 pens, a company coffee mug, and an employee identification badge rested inside, without ceremony. Noah looked down at the badge for a long moment before speaking. Will we have to move? Ethan kept his eyes on the road and smiled softly. Not today. Will everything be different? Noah asked. Ethan nodded honestly. Some things will change. The important things will not. Noah turned toward him. What are the important things? Ethan answered without hesitation. We still have our home. We still have dinner together tonight. We still have each other. That is a good place to begin. Noah quietly accepted the answer because he had learned over the years that his father never offered false promises. He offered hope instead. Across the city, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics slowly began to change. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. One engineering dashboard refreshed more slowly than usual. A customer support queue remained unusually full. An automated report failed to generate on schedule. None of those events seemed serious by themselves, but together they formed a pattern that only the system seemed to understand. Daniel Brooks, the company's chief technology officer, studied the monitoring screens from the operations center. Has anyone restarted the reporting service? He asked. An engineer nodded. Twice. Everything looks healthy. Daniel frowned. Then why are response times climbing? No one had an answer. Upstairs, Victoria Sterling prepared for a video conference with the company's largest enterprise client. She reviewed presentation notes with complete confidence, unaware that several internal services had quietly begun waiting for responses that never arrived. Her executive assistant entered the office holding a tablet. Customer support says a few clients are reporting delayed processing. Victoria barely looked up. Engineering will handle it. She believed it was another ordinary technical inconvenience. The company had solved dozens before. Meanwhile, Ethan pulled into a neighborhood diner where he and Noah often shared late lunches after school events. They ordered grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, choosing the same booth they always preferred near the front window. Outside, traffic continued moving through the rain while warm lights reflected across the wet pavement. Noah stirred his soup absent-mindedly before looking at his father. Do you think they will miss you? Ethan smiled. People usually miss solutions more than they miss people. Noah considered that answer carefully. I think they will miss both. Ethan laughed quietly, grateful that his son still believed the world could be kinder than experience sometimes suggested. At that exact moment, Daniel stared at another wall of monitoring screens. More warning indicators had quietly shifted from green to yellow. Customer requests were beginning to accumulate across multiple regions. Yet every individual server continued reporting healthy performance. Nothing appeared broken, and somehow everything was slowing down. Daniel folded his arms. This does not make sense. Hundreds of miles of code were behaving exactly as they had been instructed, yet the company itself was beginning to hesitate. Back inside the diner, Noah reached for a paper napkin and began sketching a rough diagram from memory. He had only glanced at one of the engineering dashboards while waiting outside the boardroom earlier that morning, but something about the sequence of colored indicators refused to leave his mind. Ethan noticed the drawing and smiled. Still thinking about computers? Noah nodded slowly. Dad, I do not think their system is broken. Ethan looked at him with quiet curiosity. Then what do you think is happening? Noah studied the simple sketch one more time before answering. I think everyone might be trying to solve the wrong problem. At almost the exact same moment, the first critical alarm echoed across the Sterling Dynamics Operations Center, and every conversation in the building stopped at once. The sharp tone of the emergency alert echoed through the operations center, cutting through every conversation with unmistakable urgency. Engineers immediately turned toward the towering monitoring wall as additional warning indicators shifted from yellow to bright red. Daniel Brooks stepped closer to the largest display, studying streams of live performance data that refused to follow any familiar pattern. Report status, he said calmly. One engineer answered without looking away from the screen. Infrastructure is healthy. Network latency is normal. Storage systems are stable. Another added, the servers are responding, but customer requests keep waiting. Daniel frowned. Waiting for what? No one could answer. Every graph suggested that the company should be operating normally, yet thousands of transactions had quietly stopped moving. Upstairs, Victoria Sterling ended her scheduled meeting with the company's largest enterprise client sooner than expected. Her assistant approached with visible concern. The client is reporting intermittent service delays across multiple regions. Victoria remained composed. Tell them engineering is already working on it. The assistant hesitated. They are asking for a timeline. Victoria looked toward the skyline outside her office window. Dark clouds still covered Seattle, and steady rain blurred the buildings beyond the glass. Tell them we will have an update within 1 hour. Downstairs, the atmosphere inside the operations center grew heavier with every passing minute. More customer requests continued arriving, but fewer completed successfully. Engineers restarted applications, verified databases, checked network routes, and compared software versions. Every diagnostic returned the same frustrating result. Nothing appeared broken. Daniel folded his arms. "We are checking every piece individually," he said quietly. "But the whole system is still slowing down." At the neighborhood diner, several miles away, Noah carefully finished the small diagram he had drawn on a paper napkin. Ethan watched him with gentle curiosity while taking another sip of coffee. "What are you seeing?" Noah pointed to several circles connected by simple lines. Everything they were looking at this morning was healthy. Ethan nodded. "That is usually a good sign." Noah slowly shook his head. "Not if every healthy part is waiting for the same thing." Ethan leaned forward. "Explain." Noah picked up a salt shaker and placed it in the middle of the table. Then he surrounded it with sugar packets. "Imagine every car in a neighborhood reaches the same traffic light." He touched each sugar packet one by one. "The engines all work. The roads are clear. Nobody crashed." Finally, he pointed at the salt shaker. "But if the traffic light never changes, every car keeps waiting forever." Ethan looked at the simple demonstration without speaking. Noah continued quietly. "What if their computers are not failing? What if they're all waiting for permission from something that stopped answering?" Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not surprise. It was recognition. He had heard that kind of reasoning before, years ago, while teaching Noah how large systems communicated with one another using ordinary household examples. Back at Sterling Dynamics, another executive hurried into the operations center carrying alarming news. "Our largest client says they will begin transferring operations to a competitor if service is not restored before the end of the afternoon." A deep silence settled across the room. Victoria arrived moments later, her confident expression now shadowed by growing concern. "How much time do we have?" Daniel answered honestly. "Maybe 3 hours." Victoria looked around at dozens of experienced engineers, working as quickly as possible. "Then solve it." No one moved faster because everyone was already giving everything they had. Miles away, Noah folded the napkin and carefully placed it inside his backpack. Ethan noticed the quiet determination in his son's eyes. "You still think they're looking in the wrong place?" Noah nodded. "Yes." Ethan looked through the rain-covered diner window toward the distant skyline where Sterling Dynamics stood above the city. After several thoughtful seconds, he quietly picked up the truck keys, because for the first time that day, he realized his son might already understand the crisis better than the people still trying to solve it. The drive back to Sterling Dynamics felt strangely familiar to Ethan, as though the road itself remembered the thousands of mornings he had spent traveling the same route before everything changed only a few hours earlier. Rain still covered the windshield, but the city now seemed quieter than before. Noah held the folded paper napkin carefully in his backpack and looked out the passenger window without speaking. After several minutes, Ethan finally broke the silence. "If we go back, nobody owes us anything." Noah nodded. "I know. They may not even let us inside. That is okay." Ethan glanced toward his son. "Then why do you still want to try?" Noah answered with complete sincerity. "Because if people are in trouble and we might be able to help, we should help first." Ethan smiled softly. It was the same lesson he had spent years trying to teach, yet hearing it returned by his son carried a different kind of meaning. When they arrived outside the headquarters, the atmosphere had completely changed. Emergency vehicles were not present, but employees hurried through the entrance carrying laptops, speaking into phones, and moving with visible urgency. Every face reflected the same quiet concern. Ethan and Noah entered the lobby together. The receptionist immediately recognized Ethan and looked surprised. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Melissa." She hesitated before responding. "I thought today was your last day." "It was." Ethan nodded calmly. "We are only here because my son believes he may have noticed something that could help." Melissa looked uncertain, then lowered her voice. "Engineering has been in the operations center for hours. Everyone is under a lot of pressure." Ethan thanked her anyway and turned toward the elevators. Before they reached them, Daniel Brooks stepped out of a nearby hallway while speaking with two senior engineers. His expression showed the exhaustion of someone carrying far too many unanswered questions. He stopped immediately after noticing Ethan. "You came back." Ethan remained composed. "Not for my job." Daniel looked at Noah. "Then why?" Noah reached into his backpack and unfolded the napkin with a simple hand-drawn diagram. "I think everybody is looking at healthy computers instead of whatever they are all waiting for." One of the engineers exchanged a doubtful glance with another colleague. Daniel accepted the paper and studied the rough sketch without saying a word. The drawing itself was simple, but the idea behind it immediately reminded him of a design principle he had encountered years earlier. He looked back at Noah. "Who explained this to you?" Noah answered honestly. "My dad did. He always compared complicated systems to ordinary things so I could understand them." Daniel slowly turned toward Ethan. "Did you tell him about today's failure?" Ethan shook his head. "No, we left before the alarm started." Everything he said came from what he noticed this morning and from conversations we have had over the years. Daniel looked again at the diagram. Around them, engineers continued rushing between conference rooms, carrying tablets filled with reports that still led nowhere. Another alert sounded somewhere deeper inside the building. Daniel closed his eyes for one thoughtful second before making a decision. "I cannot believe I am about to say this," he admitted quietly, "but we have exhausted every theory we had." He looked directly at Noah. "If you think you see something we missed, I will give you 5 minutes." Ethan immediately placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember," he whispered, "do not try to impress anyone. Just tell the truth as clearly as you can." Noah nodded once, took a slow breath, and followed Daniel toward the operations center, while dozens of experienced professionals unknowingly prepared to hear the most important technical explanation of the day from the youngest person in the building. The doors of the operations center slid open, revealing a room filled with giant monitoring displays, scrolling diagnostic reports, and dozens of engineers working in tense silence. Every few seconds, another notification sounded somewhere across the floor, reminding everyone that valuable time was slipping away. Noah walked beside Ethan without fear, although he immediately realized he was the youngest person in the room by many years. Curious eyes followed him as Daniel Brooks guided them toward the central display. Victoria Sterling stood near the largest screen with several executives gathered around her. She looked at Ethan briefly before focusing on Daniel. "What is happening?" Daniel answered honestly. "We have tested every theory we have. I decided to hear one more idea." Victoria noticed Noah standing quietly beside his father. Her expression revealed polite disbelief. From him, Daniel nodded. 5 minutes. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks, but no one objected. Ethan leaned toward Noah and spoke softly. "Do not worry about whether anyone agrees with you. Explain what you see." Noah smiled gently. "I will." Daniel handed Noah a digital stylus and pointed toward the interactive display. "Show us." Noah stepped closer to the screen and looked at the network diagram covering nearly the entire wall. He studied it for several silent seconds before drawing a single circle near the center. Then he connected dozens of small service icons to that one point. "Everybody keeps saying the servers are healthy," Noah began calmly. "I think they are right." Several engineers looked confused. Noah continued, "But healthy does not always mean busy. Sometimes healthy means waiting." He pointed toward the circle he had drawn. "What if every service is asking permission from the same place before doing its work?" One engineer immediately answered, The authorization broker. Noah nodded. Yes. The engineer folded his arms. We already checked it. It is running. Noah looked at him respectfully. Running is not the same as answering. The room suddenly became very quiet. Noah continued using the same simple comparison his father had taught him years earlier. Imagine one crossing guard helping children cross a street before school. If the crossing guard stands there, but never waves anyone forward, every child waits, even though the road is empty. Daniel slowly looked back toward the monitoring screens. Check authorization response time instead of system health, he instructed. Several engineers immediately began typing new commands. One of them called out only moments later. Response queue is growing. Another engineer added, the service is alive, but it stopped. Releasing waiting requests. Daniel stepped closer to another display. Why do we not see this before? An older engineer answered quietly. Because we only measured whether it was operating, not whether it was granting permissions. Victoria watched the conversation unfold without speaking. Noah stepped away from the display and looked toward his father. Ethan smiled with quiet pride, but remained silent, allowing his son to finish. Daniel turned toward the engineering team. Bypass the authorization cache and redirect temporary validation through the secondary gateway. The room instantly transformed into coordinated movement. Engineers exchanged instructions with renewed confidence. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. New graphs appeared on the monitoring wall. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then one warning indicator changed from red to yellow. Another followed. Then another. A customer transaction finally completed successfully after waiting nearly 20 minutes. Requests are clearing, one engineer announced. Response time is improving. Another smile for the first time that afternoon. Customer queues are shrinking. A quiet wave of relief spread across the operations center. Victoria looked from the recovering dashboards to Noah, then to Ethan. She realized that neither father nor son had entered the building asking for recognition. They had simply come back because someone needed help. Daniel slowly lowered the stylus onto the console before speaking words that surprised even himself. The remarkable part is not that an 11-year-old recognized the pattern, he said softly. The remarkable part is that someone taught him to understand complicated systems with enough patience that he could still recognize the truth when experienced professionals overlooked it. As the last major warning indicator faded from red to yellow, Victoria looked at Ethan with entirely different eyes, and for the first time since that morning she found herself wondering who the quiet man she had dismissed really was. The atmosphere inside the operations center changed one careful breath at a time. Warning indicators continued turning from yellow back to green while relieved conversations quietly replaced anxious ones. Engineers who had spent hours searching for invisible failures now watched customer transactions flow smoothly across the monitoring screens. Daniel Brooks remained standing in front of the central display, replaying the sequence of events in his mind. The solution itself had not been impossibly complicated. The impossible part was realizing that everyone had been asking the wrong question. Victoria Sterling slowly walked toward Ethan and Noah. Her confident stride had softened into something more thoughtful. She looked first at Noah. You helped save a very difficult afternoon. Noah smiled politely. My dad taught me how to think about problems, not just how to solve them. Victoria turned toward Ethan, studying him more carefully than she ever had during years of working in the same company. How long have you been explaining systems this way? Ethan answered with his usual calm honesty. Ever since Noah started asking questions. Noah laughed quietly. That was a long time ago. Several nearby engineers smiled. One of them looked at Ethan with growing curiosity. Where did you learn to design architecture like this? Ethan shrugged gently. Experience. A lot of mistakes. Good teachers. Patient teammates. He never mentioned his own accomplishments unless someone specifically needed the information. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Something about Noah's explanation continued bothering him. Not because it had been incorrect, but because it sounded strangely familiar. He walked toward an archive terminal near the back of the room and searched through technical documentation that had not been opened in years. Old design records appeared one after another until a file from nearly a decade earlier caught his attention. He opened the original architecture proposal for the authorization framework that still supported much of Sterling Dynamics. The first page listed the lead systems architect. Daniel stared at the name for several silent seconds before looking back across the room toward Ethan. "That cannot be right," he whispered. Another senior engineer stepped beside him. "What did you find?" Daniel rotated the monitor so everyone nearby could see it. The engineer's eyes widened immediately. "He designed the authorization framework." Daniel slowly nodded. "Not part of it. The original foundation." More archived documents appeared. Design reviews, technical diagrams, internal presentations. Every major decision surrounding the company's core authorization model carried the same signature. Ethan Walker. Victoria noticed the growing crowd around Daniel's workstation and walked over. "What is happening?" Daniel looked directly at her before answering. "The system we almost lost today exists because Ethan designed it years before I became Chief Technology Officer." Victoria blinked in disbelief. "That is impossible." His personnel file listed him as a senior systems analyst. Daniel continued searching. Another document appeared, this time containing a promotion recommendation that had never been completed. Attached was a handwritten note from an executive who had retired years earlier. Ethan Walker declined executive advancement after requesting a flexible schedule to care for his young son following the death of his wife. Recommended that he continue serving in a technical advisory capacity. Victoria read the note twice before lowering her eyes. For the first time all day, the restructuring report she had confidently presented that morning felt painfully incomplete. She had reviewed budgets, salaries, and organizational charts, yet nowhere had those pages measured wisdom, character, or quiet sacrifice. No one noticed the silence surrounding the workstation and looked toward his father. "Dad!" Ethan simply smiled. "It is all right." Daniel walked over holding several printed pages from the archives. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Ethan answered with the same peaceful expression he had carried since leaving the boardroom. "Because my son needed a father more than the company needed another executive." No one spoke after that. The operations center, which only minutes earlier had been filled with alarms and hurried voices, became almost completely silent as every person in the room realized that the greatest architect they had ever worked beside had willingly exchanged prestige for bedtime stories, school pickups, camping trips, and the quiet privilege of watching his son grow into the kind of young man who would someday teach an entire company the value of seeing what everyone else had overlooked. No one returned to work immediately. The monitoring screens continued glowing with healthy green indicators. Yet the greatest change inside Sterling Dynamics could not be measured by software dashboards or performance charts. It had happened quietly inside the people standing there. Victoria Sterling looked around the operations center and noticed expressions she had never seen before. Experienced engineers who had spent years respecting Ethan as a dependable colleague were now discovering the full weight of his sacrifice. Younger employees whispered to one another after reading the archive documents Daniel Brooks had uncovered. The silence carried more honesty than any celebration could have. Victoria finally stepped forward until she stood directly in front of Ethan. For the first time since becoming Chief Executive Officer, she searched for words that did not come easily. "This morning," she began softly, "I believed I understood exactly how to make the right decision for this company." Ethan listened without interrupting. "I reviewed budgets, productivity reports, and organizational charts," she continued. "I believe the numbers told me everything I needed to know." She paused for a moment before looking directly into Ethan's eyes. They did not. The room remained completely still. Victoria took a slow breath. "I judge your position. I never truly understood your value." Ethan answered with the same quiet grace that had carried him through the entire day. "Leadership is difficult. None of us sees everything." Victoria slowly shook her head. "That is not an excuse." She turned toward everyone gathered in the operations center. "I owe all of you something that every leader should be willing to give when necessary." Every conversation stopped. Even the gentle sound of keyboards faded into the background. Victoria stood with both hands relaxed at her sides, no longer speaking as the confident executive who had addressed shareholders that morning, but simply as another human being willing to acknowledge a mistake. "I made the wrong decision today," she said clearly. "I dismissed a man whose knowledge, integrity, and character helped build the foundation of this company. Even worse, I failed to recognize the sacrifices he made, not because he lacked ambition, but because he chose to become the father his son needed." No one looked away. Daniel lowered his eyes respectfully. Several engineers quietly nodded. Noah stood beside Ethan, listening without saying a word. Victoria turned toward the young boy. "And Noah," she said gently, "thank you for reminding every one of us that wisdom is not measured by age or job title." Noah smiled politely. "My dad always says good ideas belong to everyone." A few people quietly smiled through the emotion of the moment. Victoria looked back at Ethan. "I'm sincerely sorry." The words were simple, but everyone in the room understood how difficult they were for someone in her position to say publicly. Ethan gave a small nod. "Thank you." There was no trace of triumph in his voice, no desire to make her embarrassment last longer. He accepted the apology with the same dignity he had shown when he accepted losing his job. That quiet response affected the room more deeply than any speech could have. Daniel finally stepped forward holding the old architectural documents. "There is something else everyone should know," he said. "Many of the design principles that allowed us to recover today were written by Ethan years ago. We have been benefiting from his work every single day without realizing whose wisdom we were standing on." A respectful silence settled once again across the operations center. Victoria slowly looked around at her employees before speaking one final time. "Today I learned that organizations do not become extraordinary because of impressive buildings, expensive technology, or billion-dollar valuations. They become extraordinary when they refuse to overlook quiet people whose character cannot be measured on a spreadsheet." Ethan picked up the small cardboard box he had carried out of the building only hours earlier and gently placed Noah's hand on his shoulder. Together they began walking toward the exit once again, and this time every employee instinctively stepped aside, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because respect had finally arrived before either father or son reached the door. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan and Noah just as they reached the main lobby, but before either of them could step outside, Daniel Brooks hurried across the polished floor, calling Ethan's name. Ethan turned calmly, while Noah looked back with quiet curiosity. Daniel slowed to catch his breath before speaking. "Please do not leave yet." Ethan waited patiently. Moments later, Victoria Sterling entered the lobby, no longer surrounded by executives or assistants. She had asked everyone else to remain upstairs because she believed the next conversation required humility instead of ceremony. She stopped a few feet away from Ethan and looked first at Noah. "Thank you for giving us a second chance today." Noah smiled politely. "Everybody deserves one." Victoria nodded gently before facing Ethan. "Would you come back upstairs with me for one final meeting?" Ethan glanced at Noah, who answered with a small, encouraging nod. "We can listen," Ethan replied. Several minutes later, they entered the same boardroom where the day had begun so differently. The financial reports were still displayed across the enormous screens, but somehow they no longer seemed to dominate the room. Victoria remained standing instead of taking the seat at the head of the table. Every member of the executive leadership team quietly watched as she addressed Ethan. "This morning I believed reducing costs was the most responsible decision I could make." She paused briefly. "This afternoon I realized that wisdom, character, and trust never appear on financial spreadsheets." Richard Hayes, the chairman of the board, folded his hands thoughtfully. "Victoria has already shared today's events with the board." He looked toward Ethan with genuine respect. "We also reviewed the archived engineering records Daniel uncovered." Another board member nodded. "Your original architecture has supported this company for years." Ethan answered modestly. "It was built by many people working together." Daniel smiled. "That answer explains more about your leadership than any resume ever could." Victoria took one careful step forward. "Ethan, I would like to formally ask you to return to Sterling Dynamics. She continued before he could respond. Not because we owe you a favor. Not because you solved a crisis. Because we need the kind of leadership that teaches people instead of simply directing them. The room became very quiet. Noah looked toward his father, waiting patiently. Ethan considered the offer for several moments before speaking. If I return, I have one condition. Every person around the table listened closely. No employee should ever believe that only executives have valuable ideas. The newest intern, the quiet analyst, the experienced engineer, the receptionist greeting visitors every morning, every one of them deserves to be heard with respect. Innovation grows where humility lives. No one interrupted. Victoria slowly nodded. Agreed. Ethan continued. And one more thing. Victoria smiled softly. Name it. Ethan looked at Noah before answering. I will continue leaving the office in time to have dinner with my son every evening. No meeting will be more important than that. A warm silence settled across the room before Richard Hayes smiled. I believe that may be the wisest employment condition this company has ever received. Gentle laughter filled the boardroom, easing the weight everyone had carried throughout the day. Victoria extended her hand. Then let us build a different kind of company together. Ethan accepted the handshake with quiet dignity, not as a man reclaiming status, but as a father protecting the priorities that had shaped his life. Noah watched the moment with quiet pride, realizing that the greatest victory had never been restoring a computer system or receiving an apology. It was proving that success means very little unless it allows a person to remain faithful to the people waiting for them at home. And as the afternoon sunlight finally broke through the clouds outside the boardroom windows, everyone present understood that Sterling Dynamics had just begun a future built on respect instead of titles. Several weeks passed, and the story of that remarkable afternoon quietly became part of the culture of Sterling Dynamics. The company recovered not only from its technical crisis, but also from something far more important. Meetings gradually changed. Junior engineers found themselves invited to speak before senior executives. Interns discovered that thoughtful questions were welcomed instead of dismissed. Managers learned to spend more time listening than talking. On the wall outside the engineering division, a simple sentence appeared beneath the company mission statement. Great ideas deserve respect before they earn recognition. No one needed to ask where those words had come from. Ethan Walker returned to work exactly as he had promised, bringing the same calm presence that had always defined him. His office remained surprisingly modest. The framed photograph of him and Noah camping in Olympic National Park sat on the corner of his desk beside the same worn notebook he had carried home in a cardboard box only weeks earlier. Employees often visited him with technical questions, but many stayed longer because they discovered he offered something even more valuable than engineering advice. He taught patience. He encouraged curiosity. He reminded people that solving problems always began with understanding people first. Daniel Brooks often smiled whenever younger engineers proudly explained complicated systems using everyday examples. That is Ethan's influence, he would quietly say. When someone truly understands an idea, they can explain it simply. Victoria Sterling changed as well. She still made difficult decisions, but she no longer relied only on reports and organizational charts. Every month, she scheduled conversations with employees from different departments, asking them what obstacles they faced and what improvements they believed mattered most. She discovered that leadership became stronger when respect traveled in every direction instead of only from the top down. Whenever someone praised her for the company's renewed culture, she always answered the same way. I learned my greatest lesson from a father who never needed recognition to do the right thing. Noah became a familiar face around the headquarters, especially during school breaks. Engineers greeted him with warm smiles, and the company invited him to attend a young innovators mentoring program. Not because he had solved one important problem, but because everyone recognized his curiosity, humility, and willingness to keep learning. Noah always reminded them of the same truth. My dad says nobody ever stops being a student. Yet despite every new opportunity, one routine never changed. At exactly 5:30 every evening, Ethan closed his notebook, wished everyone a good night, and walked toward the parking garage. Some executives stayed late preparing presentations. Some engineers remained to finish projects. Ethan always drove home. By 6:30, he and Noah were sitting together at their kitchen table, sharing dinner, talking about school, books, hiking trails, and ordinary moments that never appeared on business calendars. One evening, Noah looked across the table and smiled. "Do you ever wish you had become an executive years ago?" Ethan thought quietly before answering. Success gives us many opportunities. Love teaches us which ones are worth choosing. Noah nodded as though he had expected that answer all along. Across the city, Victoria happened to be leaving the office later than usual when she looked through the lobby windows and saw Ethan's old pickup truck disappear into the evening traffic. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. The most successful man she had ever met was not driving the most expensive car, occupying the largest office, or chasing another promotion. He was simply going home to keep a promise to his son. In that quiet moment, the bustling lobby seemed to fall completely silent, and everyone who witnessed the journey of Ethan Walker understood a truth that no balance sheet, job title, or billion-dollar valuation could ever measure. Real greatness is revealed not by how loudly the world applauds a person, but by the quiet dignity with which they choose to love, to serve, and to remain faithful when no one is watching.